among other things, this way, because why the hell not? Seems like a bit of fun. And thankfully, my friend Adrian is joining me today to give this a test run. And basically, we're just going to have a chat.
Yeah,
So,
cool.
Adrian, thank you for taking the time to join me.
Yeah, no worries. This should be fun.
Yeah. So I guess before we get into some of the topics that we flagged that we might chat about, solar
Mm,
geoengineering, Australia's climate policy,
mm.
and some game B stuff.
Meaning
Perhaps it'd just be
crisis.
meaning crisis, all of these things. Perhaps it'd be good to just if you just could introduce yourself a little bit and what you're up to at the moment.
Yeah, cool. I guess technically I'm a PhD student at the Australian National University, and I'm studying climate change, specifically solar geoengineering. But I have pretty wide interests ranging from philosophy to broader climate policy internationally as well. As you mentioned as well, online there's Game B and sense making networks, which are exploring all sorts of different interesting topics that I try to keep up with. Um, yeah, I also come from a physics and mathematics background, so I try to apply that lens where it's sort of appropriate. But yeah, I guess besides my PhD, I'm a dilettante in a variety of different fields. So can talk about pretty much whatever, I guess.
Yeah, and we do. This is the second time I think we've seen each other face to face, if you'd call it that. We
Second or
normally
third?
just
Yeah.
second or third. Yeah, I can't remember. Um, so how did you get into like? I know you've told me the story about your PhD, but how did you get into looking into solar geoengineering?
Mm.
Is
I
it
guess it
solar
depends.
geoengineering?
Yeah, solar geoengineering, solar geo or geoengineering as well. It gets semantically weird because carbon dioxide removal also falls under geoengineering, but solar geoengineering is specifically about altering the Earth's albedo, and so the sort of radiative balance that the Earth's climate has. And there's a variety of ways we could do that. So the main technology that's being investigated right now is stratospheric aerosol injection. But there's
So
also
just to clarify, that's
yeah.
changing how much light is
Oh
coming
yeah,
to Earth
yeah. I
and
should
bouncing
clarify.
off.
Yeah, so there's radiative balance, which is kind of like a budget for how much radiation there is, and it should be equal. Right now, it's not because greenhouse gases warm up the planet. So
When you
presumably,
say it should be equal, does that mean like you're saying that
mm,
the energy that comes in should be roughly equal to the energy that goes out?
yeah. So in absence of other factors, that's generally what happens. A system kind of wants to go to a thermal equilibrium, but because we have a overabundance of greenhouse gases, then you have a warming effect overall. And so the idea is that you would counteract that with some other chemical agent in the atmosphere. So stratospheric aerosol injection is put some kind of aerosol like sulfuric acid, sulfur dioxide, into the stratosphere, and that reflects a bit extra light. So you could sort of reflect maybe 0.5% or 0.25% of incoming solar radiation, and that would do quite a lot to mitigate global warming as such.
Mm-hmm.
But it's pretty controversial, and the reason I got interested in the first place was a couple of years ago I was doing my honors on climate change and specifically tipping points, and reading a lot of the literature, it became apparent to me that there isn't quite a lot of, I guess, technological, but also political options that we have that are likely to reduce hazards in the short to medium term. As in, we could even if we nailed mitigation, got to net zero within 2050, like in a beautiful AI ideal world, there's still going to be climate damages. There's still going to be people that have their homes going underwater,
And
bushfires get
2050 is
worse.
like the politically acceptable number, right? I've heard 2030.
Yeah,
I remember speaking to Will Steffen on your actually
yeah.
he was one of your recommendations. He's like, the kids are right, we gotta it's 2030 or things could get bad because we might have already broached tipping points.
Yeah, exactly. And I think because I took sort of a panoptic view of Earth system science and tipping points, and it became apparent, at least to me, this is a controversial opinion, but I don't have a lot of faith that the politics is going to work out, or even maybe on the social side as well, with bottom up changes to how people are living and just the use of fossil fuels overall. But even in the best case scenario, we still have climate damages. And there wasn't in my mind until I came across this idea of geoengineering any way of actually mitigating that. And so the analogy that comes to mind, and the analogy that's used in the literature, is sort of a medical patient. If you've got a really bad fever, there might be an underlying infection that causes it that you want to address. But in the meantime, if the heat's getting too bad, you put an ice pack on your forehead, right? And so that's sort of the analogy that works for solar geoengineering. And there's a variety of different kinds of ice packs that we could use for different purposes as well. So there's marine cloud brightening, where you spray seawater into clouds and make them a bit brighter over ocean regions. And that could potentially be used to mitigate the damage from ocean heat waves for coral reefs. But that one's more speculative. There's less scientific basis and more complications in the physics that make it potentially not workable.
So there's 2 points I want to, I guess, raise here. One is, I'll say this one first, because I've heard it's like, this would be, does this sound crazy? Yes, it does.
Oh yeah.
Trying to alter the amount of solar radiation coming to Earth. Yes, it's crazy, and that should tell you how bad it is. We aren't entertaining these solutions because they're fun to think about, but the potential costs are just so high that these things are being entertained. So I guess that's kind of morbidly funny. But the second thing I was going to say is using seawater solutions sounds a lot better to me than aerosols.
It sounds nicer. Yeah.
Well, I just feel like aerosols, you've just got, the US government's bought, military, at the military scale, lots of cans of deodorant, and they just want to spray that up in the atmosphere and see what happens.
It's funny you bring up the military, actually, because one of the critiques that comes up in the academic circles that discuss this from the social science side is that this would sort of lend itself to a securitization of the atmosphere. So obviously militaries would be interested in both the use and abuse of these technologies. Some people speculated that it could be a kind of large-scale weather control, but it doesn't work out that way. The weird thing about particularly stratospheric aerosol injection is that it's a global intervention. And so it's not like you can fiddle the knobs and tweak a climate in one region but not another. It's cooling the entire planet because of circulation patterns. And so you put an aerosol up there, whether it's sulfur dioxide or calcium dust or chalk dust, or apparently diamond dust would even work technically. It's going to just
doesn't sound cheap.
No, but well, the sulfuric acid one, it turns out to be way cheaper. Yeah, that's one of the interesting parts about this possibility that we have, or option that we have. One country or a small group of countries could potentially go ahead with it without much cost, because sulfur isn't very expensive. You don't need any new technology to do it. You can just fly a plane up.
So how high are we talking?
The stratosphere is, if I can remember, it actually varies in height.
As in it varies in height, or there's like a band?
So it's a band. It's a band in the atmosphere. So you have the troposphere is the lower layer, and then you have the stratosphere above the tropopause. Near the poles, the stratosphere actually gets very close to the ground, close. And you could use planes that are around today to get up there. Stratospheric flight isn't something that we really do very often. It's something, I guess, jet fighters and spy planes. I think spy planes generally fly at the stratosphere. And so the only difficult part about it is just designing some kind of plane that can have a payload of a whole bunch of aerosols and then deploy them over some region. But that's not really that hard as far as technology goes.
I think we're pretty good at just pumping gas into the atmosphere.
Yeah, we've got a lot of experience in it. You could even do it from the ground.
What an ironic solution, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we've got too much gas in the stratosphere, in the atmosphere. Let's just pump a different kind of gas and fix it.
Yeah. So that's the thing. It's there's something about it that because it doesn't address the underlying problem, and in some way it's addressing it in a way that is part of the same thing that we've been doing so far, like interfering with nature and just spewing a bunch of pollution into the air. It's not a nice idea. It's a completely insane idea. It sounds like something out of a James Bond movie, but it is something that academic research is looking at increasingly. So there was a National Academies report in the US this year that recommended that the US government fund several $1 million into this sort of stuff. And Yes, it's something that's getting taken increasingly seriously. And my guess is that in a decade's time, it's going to be on the international sort of table of discussions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So because they're so high up, they do come down eventually, right? But it's just
yeah.
Okay.
About a
And
year.
okay. So it's not as much of a permanent solution as it kind of sounds like initially. Being someone who doesn't know much about this, I hear this, and you just want to like dim the lights and just keep them dim for a while.
Yeah. Well, ideally, it would be a temporary solution. Some have reckoned that if we start solar geoengineering, we would never be able to stop because there's a funny sort of problem in that if we taper down temperatures by something like, I don't know, half a degree or a degree of cooling, then if there were any interruption, you would get a termination shock, a sort of immediate rebound within a couple of months of however much you were cooling by. So say it was 1 degree of global average temperature, you would get that amount of global warming within a few months, which would be pretty catastrophic. And that's called termination shock. And that risk is one of the ones that is taken seriously in the research, but presents itself as a pretty serious implementation challenge and also a geopolitical challenge. Because if some countries say disagree on whatever the temperature is set at as a sort of global thermostat, maybe Russia kind of doesn't mind global warming as much, then suddenly you have a new frontier of, I guess, military and strategic conflicts in the stratosphere, which is a really concerning possible future.
Yeah, it makes me just. That's just one example of how a country or a group of individuals, in this case, a big group of individuals, but some country taking, I wouldn't even call it local action, but having global consequences, like doing something, like a small group of people could do something that could affect literally all of us. And as we're developing, increasing capabilities, it just does not seem like nation states should have sovereignty in this, like the supreme authority to over a given territory, free from external interference. Because it's like, well, if you're going to do something that's going to jeopardize all of us, we should step in, and things will step in. But I think people or countries will step in. But I think it's better if we kind of weaken sovereignty a little bit, just because of things like that.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting way to frame it as well. Just because on the purely economic, on the purely rational side, I guess, it might make sense for a country like India or the US or a group of nations like the European Union to just go ahead with it in, say, 2030, 2040 if climate damage is just so bad and they have the capacity to deploy solar geoengineering. So yeah, the real question is, in my mind, not if, but when, and also how. Like, how is it that we're going to go ahead with this? Is there going to be international cooperation to some degree? Because that's the real question. If there isn't very much cooperation, then it's going to be not a fun ride for everyone on the planet.
No, not at all. So I know that you know quite a bit about, like, you've looked into complex system science quite a bit over the years, and I feel that this sort of intervention kind of flies in the face of a lot of the sort of precepts or, I guess, notions of how to deal with a complex system. Like this is as top down, like literally top down sort of changes.
It's
and
ironic.
There's so many things that we do not know about the dynamics of the biophysical system of Earth. Like, it's just impossible to know everything. So such a dramatic intervention could have consequences that we could never foresee, and it could possibly end up being really bad. I'm just thinking, like, perhaps this Stratosol, these injections limit a certain type of wavelength of light coming in, which for some reason phytoplankton really need, and then we have huge phytoplankton die-offs, and then the bottom of some food chains end up collapsing, and then it all comes down, and like that's just one harebrained thought.
I don't think that thought experiment works out from guests, but I get your point, and I agree actually. Like, as far as I can tell on the academic research side, complexity theory and complex adaptive systems science just hasn't really had much of a say in this, which it should, because the Earth system is the most complex thing that we're we know of and are in, really, besides the known universe, and besides the human brain. But I mean, humans are part of the ecosystem, part of the Earth system, and yeah, that's the real elephant in the room. It's like, well, what about unforeseen consequences? Because you can model the Earth system and say, all right, say we cool by a degree, there might be all these externalities, there might be all these benefits. Let's try to weigh them up. And a lot of papers try to do that. A lot of them sort of show that the positives seem to outweigh the negatives. There could be really beneficial outcomes for agriculture, beneficial outcomes for fewer extreme weather events, and so on. But no one's really looked at the second or third order effects. For example, you change the radiative balance and you have more diffuse light, I think, in the end. And so that can change what kind of vegetation grows.
So would you say, like, just to make sure I understand, the light that's coming in spreads out a bit, which means that the vegetation underneath doesn't get the same sort of density of light per square inch that it normally would?
So there's been some debates in the literature about this, actually. There isn't, at the moment, a consensus on how that plays out. One paper, I recall, concludes that there, on net balance, doesn't seem to be much difference between, say, RCP 8.5, the sort of worst case scenario for climate change, and sort of full-blown Kilton.
Wait, did you say RCPA 5?
8.5. So that's 8.5 watts per square meter by 2100, I think. Yeah, so that's the extreme climate change scenario. It's not really realistic, but it's used as a sort of comparison baseline. And if you compare that world and a solar geoengineered world of some kind, in that paper, they argued that the vegetation difference doesn't seem to be very much. But other papers argue in different ways. And there hasn't been a lot of interdisciplinary work with ecologists or biologists or Earth system science researchers generally. It's very much its own niche and young field. So
yeah, it makes me think of what they like. How do they measure? What did you say? Plants? Undergrowth?
Yeah, so,
what was it? What was the word he used?
Vegetation growth.
Vegetation. Yeah, vegetation growth. I mean, you could just have lots of grass or weeds, or you could have incredibly complex ecosystems. Like, how do we distinguish between the two?
Exactly.
I mean, and do we in these things? I mean, I have no idea. I'm just
the big one with solar geoengineering is that it could alter climatic patterns and circulation patterns. One of the early concerns that has been disproven but does get reiterated a lot these days is that it could disrupt monsoons. If we just take that as a thought experiment, as an example, say we cool the Earth by 1 degree, but we disrupt the monsoon season over India, then that has a whole bunch of different externalities for people on the ground. But if that also changes vegetation growth and patterns in that local region, that's going to have a whole bunch of different dominoes falling around there, because ecosystems are all connected. Similarly, with marine cloud brightening, there was some evidence to show that if you did it in a particular arrangement, it would disrupt rainfall over the Amazon, which would obviously be a bad thing. Those are all examples of the kinds of side effects that have to be weighed up.
And from the sounds of it, it's like we're weighing up potentially averting catastrophes for human beings and potential damages to ecosystems. And we generally say human beings. I think I did those right hands. I can't remember which one I did for each, but we normally say human beings are more important. But then in the long run, the ecosystems there could be problems associated with the ecosystems, which lead to issues with the human beings anyway. And I don't know, like, as much as I think human beings are important, I think we need to kind of treat ecosystems as having, moral value, not just because they contribute to our well-being. Like, they're not just instrumentally valued, but they might have some degree of, intrinsic moral worth or something. And
agency, autonomy, potentially. There's intrinsic value to ecosystems, I agree. And philosophically, it seems like there's something very intrinsically anthropocentric about solar geoengineering. We're sort of taking the reins of spaceship Earth and trying to gear it in a direction that, I mean, we can speculate that ideally we could maybe reconfigure the climate to be better for all living organisms, but that's not what's going to happen. Yeah,
And to think, like, have we ever, when I say we, I mean just humanly, mainly our governments, have we ever made decisions completely consistently with the science ever? Like, are we just going to expect that they're going to do it right this time if
yeah,
with such a
exactly.
grand scale intervention? I mean, I'm glad that we are looking into it because things are heating up. But
Yeah, it is one of those things that, for me personally, digging into the research on it and trying to contribute to it myself, it feels kind of like a Pyrrhic victory. Even if it did work out, like it's not the kind of decision that I would want to make on behalf of the Earth myself, and I don't think any team of people would. And yeah, it's something that we probably should be researching. I think I disagree with people saying that we shouldn't research it at all. There's some that have that view. It really is a break glass in case of emergency, and we kind of are an emergency. We just don't know enough to say yet whether we should press the button and break that glass, but we should probably figure that out before we take sort of rash decisions.
yeah. Or maybe we'll change gears a little bit.
Hopefully.
And yeah, no, hopefully with regards to climate, but also in this conversation, and talk a bit about. So I saw today. So for those who are unaware, like Adrian and I both live in Australia, and Australia is not doing so good, not doing so well on the climate change front, mainly with the emissions, trying to get to net zero, and our government at the moment is squabbling over agreeing to or setting net zero emissions by 2050 targets. And I just saw a tweet earlier on today saying that members of this current government all voted to change the law so that coal and gas count as renewable energy. Now, this is coming from the leader of the Greens, like the third biggest party in Australia, but that just sounds so ridiculous that I am struggling to believe it.
Yeah, I agree. I'm struggling to pass that information in my brain that actually was a vote that occurred. If that's true, then that's yeah. It feels like any new news coming out of Australian politics with regards to climate change is indistinguishable from satire at this point.
Yeah, and I mean they're relatively popular, these guys. Like, what I really wish to, like, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I've got some notes down. I might make a little video about it or something, just because it's so ridiculous. But it's this idea that climate inaction is un-Australian because it's just antithetical to a lot of our values and our culture.
Could you expand on that a bit? I'm curious.
Yeah. So there's a few, I guess, talking points. One is that we are inextricably, we love our land and we love our waters, right? Like we have a deep attachment to the land. A lot of people like to go camping, surfing, fishing, all that sort of stuff. And right now, due to climate change, these ecosystems are collapsing. A lot of them. I think I remember seeing something in the Guardian that was or it was the conversation saying that at least 19 ecosystems around Australia are currently experiencing collapse or are on the verge of collapse. One of the main ones is the Great Barrier Reef, which will soon, it looks like it'll just be a bleached skeleton soon, right?
Yeah.
So there's this connection to the land. And, in our national anthem, it says, "Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty rich and rare," which we are kind of just saying, oh, well, too bad. Coal jobs are really important. So that's one thing. The coal, I guess that brings us to the economic side of it, right? So Australia, majority of our exports comes from, I think the biggest is iron ore, and then coal, natural gas, and there's, agriculture, all that sort of stuff. So if we just ignore iron ore, because I think iron's kind of important in the world, so we're probably still going to be, we're still going to be digging stuff up out of the ground. That's fine. And particularly if we want nuclear. Now, if we go nuclear, but the whole world is reducing the demand for coal and natural gas, or if they're not doing it now, they will be doing it soon. And if that's one of our biggest industries, what are we going to do then? And even livestock production, just for exporting meat. If we bring in carbon credits or carbon taxes, and we see the rise of lab-grown meats, we could see demand for those things reduce, or quite considerably as well. So two of our biggest industries are threatened by climate action, you could say.
Yeah.
And if we take, so you could say, like, if you care about, like, if someone might be listening to this and thinking, yeah, it's our national interests, to keep these things propped up because it's good for our country, it's good for all that. And it's like, yeah, well, like, if you're making lemonade but no one wants your lemonade, then maybe you should change something else. You should start selling something else.
Yeah, well, can I push back on a point briefly? And this is more of a devil's advocate thing, and based on what's happening currently with supply chains and the natural gas shortage, there's been a lot of debate over the last couple of years over whether natural gas is a transition fuel or not. Strictly speaking, the evidence doesn't really back it up. However, industry and some economists, and hell, even Alan Finkel, the previous chief scientist, was arguing that natural gas is a transition fuel. If we take that point of view, just like momentarily, and consider for the moment that there are global fuel shortages, which they themselves, there's production lines, there's supply chains, even just heating in homes. It looks like the winter is not going to be particularly great for the Eurasia region and Greater Europe. A lot of people still rely on natural gas for heating. And so this is sort of the conundrum that we're looking at, not even just in the developed world, but also in the developing world, where although green growth is technically doable, getting the sociopolitics to work out, and also in some cases the economics, broadly speaking, renewables are cheaper, but for some infrastructure, particularly heating and AC, fossil fuels still have a role to play, unfortunately. And it's that transition is extraordinarily hard when we're combating a bunch of other things like just natural weather hazards and these supply chain shortages as well, where it's hard to swap out a gas-fired heater for an electric one in the middle of a snowstorm.
And for the entire population.
Or the entire population of a country. Yeah, exactly.
And to supply enough electricity to replace the gas that would have been, if you have a gas-fired stove, or I don't know how people heat their homes, to be honest. I've never lived in a cold place. So, but I'm assuming they might use some fossil fuel, or they might be electric. I don't know.
There's different countries in the world that still do. So yeah, I think that aspect of it is partly why, especially for the politics in Australia, but just broadly speaking, the transition's been so hard. And with the benefit of hindsight, we can say, all right, 20, 30 years ago, if we just transitioned to all electric, that would have been great. We had the capacity to do so then, for the most part. But we're in this weird situation now where we have to transition, but at the same time, we're so reliant on these things that we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot at the same time.
Yeah. I don't think it would make sense for us to, I wouldn't call for just the abolition of these exports, because other countries need them. There's that one argument that the West in general has, over the past century, the developed, if you want to call them that, countries have really benefited from the use of fossil fuels, and now other countries want to pull themselves up the, economic growth ladder. We're going to say, sorry, you can't do that anymore. Perhaps that's not especially fair. So I think maybe reducing, still exporting to a certain degree would be good. I mean, I by far not an expert here, but I guess what I'm thinking more is having more of a plan for the future.
We
have the world's biggest, and that doesn't mean that just because we're exporting it doesn't mean that we have to be consuming it or using it, right?
Yeah.
We've still got coal-fired power stations. We have the world's largest uranium resources, right? One of our states, Queensland, which is half the size of Europe, is called the Sunshine State. Australia gets some of the most sunshine in the world as a continent or a country, right? So it's we've got some options there.
We could be a net energy exporter, or a net renewable energy exporter, without even breaking a sweat. There are some plans to do so, but man, we are behind the curve there.
I just think we're actually, so all Australians, I mean, all people kind of care about the economy because they just realize that their well-being depends upon the economy to, a decent degree. But we have the opportunity to become an energy superpower, and there's, energy is the constant. It's like the currency of life. No matter at what scale, you need energy to do stuff. And if we want to become this, as we keep ascending, if we want to call it that, we need more and more and more energy. and we are in a great position to provide that energy for a lot of countries and a lot of people. And I mean, we're kind of doing it, but we're not doing it in a way that I think is sustainable in the long run. And we're just kind of twiddling our thumbs. I mean, we do have, I'm pretty sure there is a solar farm up in the Northern Territory that's going to be shipping energy to Singapore, which is great. I don't know too many of the details about that, but
I can't recall the details either. But I think there was some plans also to sort of increase the scope of that project or similar projects and sort of export energy to that side of the world. We definitely could. The other big avenue for progress there is hydrogen export as well, liquid hydrogen as well. Because we have such ridiculous amounts of renewable energy resources in Australia broadly, we could just be producing hydrogen cleanly, and hydrogen could definitely replace natural gas as a fuel in most cases. There's some issues with power density scaling for like airplanes and stuff, but for the most part, hydrogen just it's great.
Do you know much about nuclear? I mean, you're going to get into fission fusion, right? So I'm sure you know a little bit.
Yeah. I know a little bit.
I mean, there's like the science, but in terms of the engineering, the safety, do you know? I know as much as I could read from, articles online and watching a Cursor Gut video, right? How the hell you say that YouTube channel? I'll just flag that I cannot believe that YouTube channel has gotten so popular with a name like that. It just goes to show that, the name isn't that important.
Quality over name. Yeah, no, for sure. So I'm by no means an expert in nuclear energy or sort of the politics or the engineering there, but I know a few things. And one of the limiting factors isn't really, so people argue over whether or not nuclear is green, and it seems like a red herring to me. And I think a lot of climate scientists are coming on board to this view where we're running out of time to be doing things. And as far as a unified front on just environmental problems and transitioning away from fossil fuels, banning nuclear in some countries or just like shutting down nuclear power plants and then having to reinstall fossil fuel based energy supplies is just absurd. So and that's controversial in some green circles, but man, I don't think those counter arguments regarding, say, like proliferation of nuclear weapons and nuclear waste as well, like just if you look at the amount of nuclear waste that's produced from however much nuclear power you want to consider, it's not a whole lot. And we're pretty good when we want to keeping nuclear waste stored away. There are some issues, I think, around Indigenous rights and Indigenous land heritage in some areas, but that's just unfortunate mismanagement of the politics in those areas. It doesn't need to be the case again. The limiting factor, I think, is both on the social and the political side. So socially, still not fully accepted in various countries, including Australia. Politically, but on the regulation side, the construction of a nuclear power plant shouldn't take 20, 30 years. It's just insane. A lot of that is just regulatory baggage. That's my understanding. And the withering away of the skilled labor and the knowledge of how to do nuclear engineering.
The tacit, like, you can get a whole bunch of people together to do it, but if they've done it for the first time, then if they're doing it for the first time, then it might take a while. I think it does take about 20 years. I think that's but the times have been getting like higher.
It's bizarre. Time? Yeah, you'd imagine the innovation would have gone the other way, but we're somehow still stuck with I think it's second or third gen nuclear reactors, whereas we really should be at fourth generation radio reactors and using thorium and all that, which anyone who's spent some time on energy Twitter or energy circles online, just thorium always gets sort of shipped as a awesome idea and solution, and on paper it is, but it just never happens because the politics doesn't work out and the engineering, it just hasn't been done before. So
I remember seeing that like 5 years ago and thinking it might just be some conspiracy because I was on a subreddit like that, and I'm like, I don't know enough to be able to make sense of this, to really give the thumbs up or the thumbs down. But these people it seems too good to be true. We can get thorium in sand. It's like really good for, I mean, I think we can get it in sand. This is what I'm remembering from a few years back. It's like, the waste is way better. It's nuclear energy. It produces a lot.
Yeah, you can use the nuclear waste of another facility as the fuel for a thorium plant. It's been a while since I've looked at that, but man, again, it's the politics of innovation that just don't work in nuclear's favor. But realistically, and in a fully techno-optimist world, we'd be deploying nuclear left, right, and center. Even statistically speaking, when people point to, oh, what about Fukushima and Chernobyl, it doesn't work out. Like, there's more deaths from air pollution from fossil fuels than there have been in the totality of nuclear power. So yeah, and you look at France as well as a case study of a country that uses most of its energy, or a ridiculous percentage. It's both hydro and nuclear that's their base load, and it's like, well, why aren't we just doing that globally? So
Yeah, it's funny that air pollution argument isn't leveraged more against cars. And like the push towards, like we say, I think we should, the marketers, or I don't know who, the activists shouldn't be talking about transitioning to electric cars because of for climate change. It should just be like, do you care about your children and their lungs? Here are the stats about how many people die early because of air pollution, and it's because of cars like that.
Yeah,
and to just imagine like no longer hearing those massive buses or lorries with those huge engines just shaking the foundations of your building as they try to get up a hill.
Yeah.
I long for that day.
The public health framing is probably one of the more effective ones for climate policy and climate action, but it's just not employed as often. Which is unfortunate, but I don't know. Air pollution is one of those things that it's based on a lot of stats. You don't hear a lot about it on the news.
You don't. We're simple creatures, right? You see it, right? You have to see it for it to be a bad thing. I mean, if it was a volcano, we'd probably act. If it's something very visible. But how do you even? How does air pollution kill you? I mean, increases your chances of getting cancer. Maybe it does some stuff with your heart. Like maybe respiratory damage, and you're not breathing as well, and in the long run. So it's not exactly like you're getting shot or hit by a car or something that's incredibly obvious and salient. Well, we'll wrap up soon, but maybe we can just transition to the last sort of topic we had penned down. I guess we've got a few options. We can talk Game B, which is, I think, how we first met. It was in the Game B, the Game B community, and I saw that you were in.
That's right.
Yeah. So I saw this thread the other day of a guy, I can't remember his name, but collating all of the descriptions of what Game B is. And I can't remember many of them. But if you were to try to describe what this idea of Game B is, how would you do it?
It's funny that it's hard to define, and I think it talks to the pervasiveness of what Game A is conceptualized as. So because we were talking about a lot of environmental problems before, this is all predicated on a particular system of, you can call it capitalism, you can call it neoliberalism, whatever you like. The current pervading system of the way we're doing things, economically, politically speaking, this rivalrous sort of way of approaching the world and extracting resources from nature for our own use, etc. These all fall under the banner of Game A. And so the way I understand it is Game B is this concept of a civilization or a group or a community that embodies some kind of mode of being in the world that is anti-rivalrous and cooperative fundamentally. And it's tried to distinguish itself from just cooperative communities and like homesteading and that kind of culture. And there's some movements in the 60s and 70s that had very similar ideas. But this is generally framed much more broadly and with regards to economics and politics as well. So people like Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall have various ways of talking about it, and particularly the game theory around it. And it's sort of, it goes from the cognitive science of like how it is that we interact on a day-to-day basis with our loved ones and friends, to the sociopolitics and the environmental problems and the meta crisis, I think it's been coined as well.
Yeah. Would you call it like it strikes me as practically utopian, but like utopian's doing a lot of work there. Like I don't mean that pejoratively. It's like Game A is the status quo. Game B is the world in which it's the operating model, or it's the model where
we solve all the problems somehow,
we're not just jumping around singing kumbaya. We still encounter problems, but they're not problems. They're not existential threats, right? Like we aren't generating as many existential threats.
I think
and
the key distinction that someone like Daniel Schmachtenberger makes is that in a game B world, the generator functions for these problems, these existential problems, are also solved or altered in some way. So it's not just that we solve climate change, we solve air pollution, whatever it is. It's that the underlying dynamics which give rise to those things themselves have been addressed. And that's really, I think, in my mind, what's utopian about it. I used to be really interested in the development of that community on Facebook and the sort of sense-making community around it on Twitter and YouTube. Channels like Rebel Wisdom, podcasts as well around that space. And
Jim Rutt's show is great. The
Jim Rutt show is great. Yeah, and Jim Rutt also sort of coming from the complexity science tradition as well has a unique viewpoint on this. And it's absolutely 100% a kind of new utopian narrative that rivals kind of the communist type, or even the what do you call it, the sort of neo-capitalist techno-optimist type as well. Like there's all sorts of utopian ideals for the future in which these problems are solved. But this one's quite different.
It seems very grounded. It seems very like for my explorations, it seems quite grounded. I mean, perhaps I'm just thinking of, rather than the group or the movement or whatever you want to call it, this amorphous thing, the thinkers that I've listened to seem to be grounded.
Yeah, I agree with that. The other thing is it's inherently decentralized, and you see that in the social networks in which it arises. You know, there's the hashtag GameB on Twitter. There's the GameB wiki, which is decentralized, obviously. There's the Facebook group. There's podcasts that mention this term, but it's not like there's a website with a manifesto on it, which I think is the most interesting thing. It's sort of an idea that's sparked up, not by its own. It was, I think, originally sort of developed in a think tank style meeting between Jim Rutt and a couple of the Santa Fe Institute guys, and Brett Weinstein, I think, as well, was involved, in Jordan Hall. But then it sort of resurged over the last couple of years. It's been a while since I've really tapped into it, but yeah, it's definitely generated a whole bunch of really interesting conversations in that space, which is cool.
Yeah. I've any of the podcasts or discussions that I've listened to with, I guess you could say, some of the bigger, even like not even just the big names, but I guess they are the ones that I tend to listen to more. But I always come away feeling a lot more like I've got a better grip of how things are going, but also not just those people, but like people in the game B space tend to be pretty switched on, very open, multidisciplinary. I think it selects for a certain type of personality. But I come away feeling hopeful, but I just wish there was more stuff happening. But I guess it's also really hard, like in this leaderless bottom-up way of doing things. And with the forethought that kind of needs to go into something like trying to bring about something like this, the transition towards something new. Yeah, I guess it can be pretty tough. And I think what we're lacking perhaps is the aesthetic, like the solar punk aesthetic. We're lacking the vision of like this direction.
We
have this idea. We need a brand. We need a brand. We need like the equivalent of the cross.
Yeah, no, the hammer is
but not a religion.
Yeah, not a religion. And I mean, this is where it crosses.
The religion that is not a religion, right?
Yeah, some of John Vervaeke's stuff in cognitive science and the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis work. So, because that runs in parallel and crosses over, because I know Jordan Hall is involved in that style of thought. Yeah, I honestly, because I have a pretty strong pessimism bias on these things, I probably read too many academic papers and then think too much about them. I look at Game B and I think it's awesome, but there's something about it that it's both the utopian flavor that it has, but also because it's so bottom up and largely online. I'm not aware of any currently existing community that embodies Game B in any way that would make sense to actually say. I think a couple of people are trying.
So, when you say embody Game B, so I see it as partially at the moment an exploration phase, right? Like you can't embody the destination, if that makes any sense. Like we're kind of identifying ways of being now that will help take us there.
I disagree to a certain extent. I think the exploration phase necessitates some experimentation as well, because it's all well and good to talk about it online to the nth degree and to the ends of the universe, which has been sort of my experience of it. Lots of interesting theoretical discussion, lots of great podcasts, but all right, what are we actually doing now? And maybe that's part of the climate stuff also rubbing off on me, where people continually ask, okay, but what are we actually going to do? What are we actually changing in terms of policy? It's all well and good to publish papers and talk about it on Twitter, but any of the people in the climate activist space really talking about actual change. And in that same way, I think Game B suffers from a similar problem that academic disciplines in general have, or sort of theoretical philosophical movements have. It's great. I think you do have to address some metaphysical foundations to a certain degree, and some, just exploration of different ways of thinking, different ways of talking. But if there isn't a community out there that is actually trialing this in some sense, then we don't know empirically or in a sensible fashion if it's going to pan out. Human nature is a thing, so.
Yeah, I think perhaps the distributed nature of it, like I think we have internet tribes. I think a lot of us we belong to these internet tribes, but they're not, I'm generalizing here, but I think for a lot of people, they're not reflected in your local communities, right? Like your internet tribe, you probably don't have 50 people within walking distance who you can talk to about this sort of stuff, or whatever you're into, right?
Yeah.
And that separation, like, you need to go from the digital to the physical. Like, it needs to be, like, it's all well and good having these conversations, but it's about bringing it into the local. And local requires co-location. It requires going outside and probably not picking up and building a city in some rural part of whichever country you're in, but trying to transform the existing city in which you're in.
Yeah.
Like, some cities have been around for a long time. They are very, very, like, they're alive, right?
Yeah, they're super organisms of a kind.
Yeah. Like, some cities have been like burnt down repeatedly and they come back,
Yeah.
So we need to try fixing those.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, so start from the center and work out from there.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was a nice brief foray. I know this is just a test live stream. So I guess to wrap up, what are you currently excited about at the moment?
So my PhD has taken an interesting turn, and I'm going from a PhD by publication to one by monograph. So it's more of a book, and I'm trying to find a new theoretical framework to put it in. And so I'm exploring some of Benjamin Bratton's ideas. He wrote the book The Stack, and another one on politics in a post-pandemic age or something like that. And he's got a fascinating view of sort of biopolitics and geopolitics with a digital spin on it. Which I think is adequate to think about in terms of geoengineering as well. So the word geoengineering is inadequate. He uses the term geodesign to talk about a whole bunch of other things. So that's something I'm investigating. It
makes me sorry to just jump in there, but it kind of like, I kind of like that to a certain degree, because we need to. I just spoke with Tyson Yunkaporta, and
I love that podcast. Yeah, it's great.
No, I'm glad. He's good fun. He's good fun. He's just disarming and just a laugh. And I was thinking, one of the things that he said, and I've heard this echoed elsewhere, is just, we need to reclaim our place reclaim our space in the world as custodians of the land. I kind of see us as gardeners, and I've heard this reflected in different books. I guess complexly aligned books that, even just from governments, our governments kind of should be acting as like gardeners, setting up the environment, like setting up the operating environment, so that companies act within it, setting the fitness function for the operating environment such that companies and everything within it, all the agents within it, act in a certain way that achieves goals that we all wish to.
Automatically.
Yeah. But there's a bit of, I like geodesign, but I think there's a bit of, I want to say hubris, or I think it's not quite okay, because I think I like this gardener. I like the idea of being a caretaker or a gardener rather than the architect. We want to be a species that nurtures and sets things up in such a way so that things may happen in ways that we want them to, but also be open to novelty, to things that we wouldn't have expected, right? Because we have no idea what the hell's going on. Like, so we might as well just like let life do its thing and like try to avoid catastrophe.
Yeah. But at the same time, part of being a caretaker is not letting weeds just take over a garden necessarily. And so in an act of design or creation, there's also acts of destruction. It's sort of a Taoist thing to say almost. And yeah, I mean, certain words like design or engineering, they have certain connotations because they're born out of a Western paradigm, but they don't necessarily need to. And I think if we have the right philosophical foundations, the right ethical foundations, then the way we approach certain, let's say, design problems for civilization or for existential risk management, hell, even the word management sounds awful, right? We should account for the fact that we're not the only species on this planet. Explicitly instead of just saying it and trying to tokenize it.
And reflect that in our laws, in our values, like our religions. Like we need like a religion that's consistent with the science, and maybe that I don't know about that term religion. Like I think it's got too much baggage, but we need something, because we've all got religions in a way, right? yeah, true. I think a lot of people end up they jump into something and they treat it like a religion, whether they know it or they don't. Anyway, just to stop us from going on to, going on other tangents, because I know that we can be here for another few hours. Anything you want to say before we wrap up?
No, it's been a fun, quick conversation. That went by in a flash.
Yeah. It's really good. Well, Adrian, thanks for jumping on this test live stream with me. Let's see how it turns out.
Yeah, no worries. Let's do another one sometime soon.
Sounds good.
All right.